Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ambassadors, executives, advisors, and special guests, and welcome to the very first lecture of the Digital University of the G17 University Ambassadors Consortium for 2022. I'm Menasha from G17 Sri Lanka, and I will be your host for this evening. We are beyond excited to have our global fraternity of change makers here with us to embark on this knowledge-driven journey. As you all know, the G17 University Ambassadors Consortium is a global undergraduate platform initiated by Road to Rights, a youth-led organization with its ultimate vision to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development within the university community. To date, we boast of over 2,000 ambassadors from 15 different countries from over 70 universities globally. G17 is dedicated towards empowering university undergraduates on sustainable development goals to become the next generation of young professionals and make SDGs a reality through its 4 pillars: capacity building, leadership, policy advocacy, and action. To give you a small idea about today's session, we will be dedicating a large portion of this evening to our module content and to our guest lecturer here with us tonight, after which we will be opening up the floor to a moderated Q&A session before we conclude today's session. And now is my privilege to introduce our first esteemed guest speaker, who will introduce us to our very first module on sustainable development and the United Nations SDGs, Professor Paul Walsh. Professor Paul Walsh currently serves as the Vice President of Education and Director of the Sdg Academy. He's also a Professor of International Development Studies, Director of the UCD Centre for Sustainable Development Studies, and Director of the UCD M.Sc in Sustainable Development in partnership with the UN SDSN. He is also the contact point for the UCD in terms of UCD's consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council and a member of the UN Major Group for Science and Technology. He is also an instructor for Harvard Extension School teaching foundations of sustainable development, and he received his Ph.D. in economics from the London School of Economics in 1994. His academic career spans multiple countries, including Ireland, Brussels, England, as well as Tanzania, and is a fellow in all of these countries. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just the tip of the iceberg of all of his qualifications. And on behalf of G17 University Ambassadors Consortium, I am beyond grateful to have you here tonight with us, sir. And now I would like to invite Professor Walsh to begin the session. Professor Walsh, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very kind invitation, and I'm delighted to be here. Again, that seems like a long list of credentials, but all that means is that I'm very old, and I've no doubt that everyone in the audience here will have plenty of opportunity to achieve at least that amount of achievement and even more. And hopefully, I've come, like many, to the Sustainable Development Goals a little bit later in life, but you have the opportunity to do it early in life and to actually go on the right pathways. So today, what I want to do is I'm going to divide my talk into 2 sections. One is just to give, and I'm sure all of you here, you're ambassadors for the SDGs in universities. I'm sure you know the SDGs, but I'm just going to review the way I see the history or how the Sustainable Development Goals evolved in history from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'll do it obviously in a short, just to give you an overview of that. And then I'll actually look forward a little bit. And what I'll do is copy what the Secretary General did in the General Assembly in last year in 2021, where I thought it was unusual because normally when the heads of state come to the General Assembly, what's called UNGA Week, or the United Nations General Assembly Week, normally, you know, the messages, you know, we have to we're here together, we should be positive, we should promote peace, we should get to work on the Sustainable Development Goals, we should get to work on human rights. But actually he did something a little different, where he actually was outlining a thing called our common agenda, but he actually set up a scenario of dystopian threats versus sustainable development pathways. So for the first time, he literally was saying, we are not on a good track when it comes to peace. We are not on a good track when it comes to climate. We are not on a good track when it comes to social inequalities. And we're not on a good track when it comes to hunger and poverty, etc., which is just to highlight to people that multilateralism is in trouble. In a sense, the SDGs are on the rocks, and more than ever, people have to fight for peace and for sustainable development, because, you know, in 2015, it looked like the start of something. It looked like a moment of triumph for multilateralism, and it looked like from that point, we were going to go on a trajectory where the project, particularly the Sustainable Development Goal project, and the Paris Agreement were going to, you know, bed down and be very, very successful. The reality is that we have in some ways gone backwards. And what we're trying to do is to regroup and to basically start fighting for peace and for sustainable development in a way that we haven't done properly up to this point. Okay, so first thing, I'll look at history. In other words, let's look at the, you know, the 1949 up to 2015, and then we'll look at what happened in terms of the way the UN is trying to regroup and try and re-establish, obviously, multilateralism and obviously pathways to peace, which is a necessary condition for pathways to sustainable development. Okay, and so that's the way I want to look at this. So I'm going to share my slides. Hopefully they're there. No, they're not. So I'm going to have to put them up first. So here we go. Okay, so I'm living a little bit of a complex life in the sense that I am a career academic based in Ireland. So universities in Ireland, I'm sure, like in many places where you're from, are actually state universities. So I'm a government official actually, because I work in the university. And I basically, after COVID, I had been working with Professor Jeffrey Sachs on the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which I'll explain in a second. And I was on the board of that, etc. But I decided that I wanted to get more involved because I do think it's become an emergency in terms of what's happening to climate and what's happening on the pathways to sustainable development. And, you know, rather than staying in the university in my everyday roles, I've decided to go on what we call secondment to the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And I'm acting as their Vice President of Education and Director of the Sdg Academy, where we have 60, if you like, MOOCs or free online courses, which you can do on edX. You should have a look at them. In fact, there was a ranking out yesterday listing the best free online courses for sustainable development across all the universities in the world. And our MOOCs, Jeffrey Sachs's MOOC on the age of sustainable development was #1 overall, but in all of they listed them under all the SDGs. And we have courses in all the 17 goals, and they're all top 5, top 10 courses across the world. So I would definitely say have a look at the Sdg Academy. They're free, open source courses on edX, and it's a great way to learn about the SDGs overall and each of the individual goals. So secondment means that I'm still in UCD and I do the M.Sc in Sustainable Development, but I'm basically, if you're into sport, I'm on loan, if you like, or I'm seconded out or leased out to the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Okay, but so effectively for these 5 years, I'm in an operational role working mainly for Sustainable Development Solutions Network and focusing on education, sustainable development education. So like I said, I want to just talk a little bit about my perspective on the history of where the goals came from, or the Sustainable Development Project, and then I might I'll move into part two, which is just looking at the challenge that we're all facing at the moment in terms of trying to redirect our energies away from these dystopian pathways and threats towards sustainable development possibilities, which we've been given in the Paris Agreement and the Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Everyone here knows this, but there can be confusion in faculty and universities about what is sustainability and sustainable development. And we in the UN, obviously, and the SDGs work with the Brundtlands. This is the Norwegian minister or leader, a lady, Minister Brundtland, who this definition in 1987 was very clear about sustainability in what's called the economic, like sustainable livelihoods, sustainable societies, sustainable environment. But some people have forgotten there's a fourth pillar, and this is sustainable governance, right? So in a sense, when you think about sustainability moving forward, you've got to think of good governance, which is the SDG 16 and SDG 17. You should think of the economic goals, the social goals, the environmental goals. Now, obviously, the whole idea is that it's an integrated project and that you have to achieve all goals simultaneously, and you've got to build linkages across the goals or across the pillars of sustainable development, but in a kind of simplistic way. And I think it's very useful for people in their everyday life, or people in corporates, or people in government, to say, well, what this is about here is that when we're doing things in our everyday life, what type of harm, whether intentionally or unintentionally, are we doing to people in society, and what type of harm are we doing to the environment? And that, so in every action we do, if it's an economic action, we've got to just think about societal and environmental implications. It's a policy action, even if it's in the economic, like the Department of Finance or a planning department, it can't be solely focused on economic outcome. They've got to understand the social and environmental implications. And of course, for corporates, they work with this concept of ESG. This is in our strategic planning or actions, we have to, or in our value chains globally, we've got to understand the impact we have on the environment, on society and governance in each country that we operate in. So, and it's the same in everyday house. When you walk out the door, go into the university, to be a little bit more conscious how you coexist with other people, both in your community and nationally and globally, and what sort of the interdependencies you have with other people in societies and communities, like the global village, as we call it, and what sort of interdependencies we have with nature, because this is somehow the human weakness, that we don't really internalize the damage we do on others and on the environment in the way we've set up our political systems, our economic systems, and our social systems, right? But just to stress here, there are four pillars. And if people talk about the societal, environmental, and economics, but sometimes forget about the importance to transform governance and to have good institutions and to have peace and partnerships and so on. The very brief history, so 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In a sense, we've been talking about the same things, all the way for the last 75 years. The terminology is changing, the responsibility and roles of different committees are changing, and people have reframed them in different languages, etc. But in reality, this has been a continuum of thinking in terms of how things have evolved, right? So in 72, I will show you the Earth Summit in 72, I think really was the beginning of people thinking more seriously about integrating environmental issues into mainstream economic and social issues, okay? If you were a kind of a development person in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you probably were very focused on what we'd call industrial development. You looked at a country and you wanted to move up the value chain. You want to move from an agrarian society into agribusiness, into manufacturing, into export to manufacturing, into financial services, into traded financial services. And it was very much about going up the value chain in an economic sense, generating gross domestic product, or having a GDP growth as we see it, right? And people kind of understood that that should bring in tax income and opportunities to build roads and hospitals and schools. And so they did see, they were hoping that there would be trickle down and that there would be benefits, obviously, to society and government, etc. But the focus was on industrial development. But as we know, Brundtland, obviously, I've gone through this already, defining the pillars of sustainable development and trying to introduce the concept that really it's about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, but on these four pillars of good governance, of sustainable livelihoods, sustainable societies, and environment. Okay, Rio +20 was a kind of a key moment, again for the SDGs. Again, trying to say a lot of the work of the UN and the way people are thinking is that, you know, then they start to think about Amartya Sen's capabilities approach and thinking about human development and saying, you know, GDP is a means, but it's not an ends. We've got to start thinking about human development rather than just economic development. And this was the push then to start thinking about, you know, let's measure income, but obviously in a human development index, let's measure life expectancy, let's measure school outcomes. So start thinking about human development or kind of social indicators and social outcomes as much as we're thinking about economic outcomes. But again, in Rio, people were, and this was the basis of the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals, there were 8, and I won't go into it in detail. They were a little bit social in their orientation. They were trying to get people away from pure economic objectives and into health and education objectives. But there were environmental, in the sense water and sanitation was quite important. And they did add, eventually they were adding targets on climate change. And of course they had the partnership goal. But we must remember that the Millennium Development Goals was more a framework for how the OECD DAC, this is the Development Assistance Committee, that came up with it. It was more of a framework for how we transfer resources or to overseas development aid or foreign aid from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere, or the OECD high-income countries to low and middle-income countries. And it was a kind of a framing for setting baselines on, you know, achievement in things like poverty and gender equality and schooling and child mortality and water and sanitation and so on and so forth, and HIV, AIDS, and malaria outcomes. But it was more, in a sense, to have a framework for monitoring and setting targets around overseas development aid. So it wasn't really an agenda for the OECD at all. Human development really wasn't something that was in newspapers or tracked, but it was an important framework and became an important framework for Africa and other countries as we went into the 21st century. But the focus was definitely on human development, even though you could see environmental issues and societal issues embodied, okay? Now I'd have to say that going back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s with this concept of economic development, there were writers like Hirschman who, when they were looking at investment criteria for industrial development, would write in social criteria. So what they would say is, so for example, in Ireland, when we were attracting multinationals and giving them tax breaks and giving them factories and roads to ports to export to Europe, we would ask them to create social linkages. So, for example, they would have to be good at employing people, paying social insurance, paying towards health outcomes. In other words, creating decent jobs. They would create linkages and promise to work with small and medium-sized businesses, and create linkages to the Irish businesses within Ireland, etc. And the other thing is they would be export orientated and not actually compete in the local market to increase our terms of trade and so on. So the reality is that, and we had the Environment Protection Agency, who was concerned about water quality and air pollution and issues like that. So it's not that social and environmental issues were not built around industrial policies or industrial development, but it wasn't really that explicit. I think in the Millennium Development Goal Project, the relationship between the North and Southern Hemisphere, it was making explicit that it's not just about GDP, it has to be about human development. And then coming into Rio Plus 20, the future we want, it started, and this was primarily because of Colombia, the country, and South America in particular, pushing for what was called the Commission on the Environment to be integrated with economic and social dimensions. So they were starting to say that we cannot separate out our thinking about environment and economy and society anymore. We've got to integrate our frameworks and integrate our committees. And that's started the agendas for what's called the post 2015 agenda. There was 3 years, from 2012 to 2015, there was 3 years of work plans by governmental and non-governmental folks to come up with what we now know as the SDGs and the targets and the UN 2030 agenda, but it was to think about this integrated framework. And secondly, they wanted a universal framework, meaning that it wasn't just every country had to do this, right? So when you set the goals, the SDGs, they're for the 193 states, because the United States and Europe and China and so on, you might have good economic growth, you might have decent societal outcomes, but actually they have very poor environmental issues around the use of natural resources, and also around pollution. Using the earth as a source and as a sink was some very poor outcomes in the so-called rich income countries. So in a sense, this integrated framework of economy, society, and environment also had to be a universal agenda that every country had to take responsibility for. And this is a big change, because you could imagine that the people who are funding the UN system and funding the MDGs, that they were now setting themselves up to, in a sense, to have goals and targets that they would be, what we call follow up and reviewed on through voluntary national reviews. In other words, there would be accountability on the rich nations, in a sense, to achieve targets and goals across all of these dimensions. And there would be, in a sense, a responsibility and a follow-up and review and a monitoring of this. So this is a very big departure. If you think about two big things: integrating environment into mainstream into economic and social conversations, and then making it a universal, so an indivisible agenda across the pillars and a universal agenda across all countries. And it wasn't just across all countries, actually, it was across all countries and all stakeholders, because they wanted the private sector, academia, civil society, and governments to actually simultaneously sign up. And the duty bearer was not the government, actually. Led by government, the duty bearer is the stakeholder partnerships. It's that everyone has to take responsibility, both, whether in their academic sphere or government sphere or corporate or civil society or community. So this is a huge kind of different type of narrative that came from the Rio Plus 20, written by David O'Connor in UN DESA, The Future We Want, back in 2012. And that was actually the birth of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network as well, because Jeffrey Sachs was a special advisor to Ban Ki-moon, and built into Rio Plus 20 there was a paragraph that the work plans would have to be overseen by science and academic and legal oversight. And that's exactly what this, that's how the SDSN got set up under the offices of the Secretary General, because it had responsibility to do the synthesis report that brought the work together over those 3 years and actually have the academic and legal oversight. And when that work was done, it went into the 9 months of negotiation, intergovernmental negotiation, where it was co-facilitated by the Ambassador of Ireland and Kenya, Donoghue and Kamau, and they produced what we now know as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Developing, or Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview, but it's just this struggle, you know, to, you know, pinpoint, like to recognize the role of people in human dignity and human rights, which was a theme right from 1948. The kind of separate sort of focus on economic development to social and environmental, even though there were obvious kind of advances in those areas, but to eventually bring them together as a unified or indivisible framework around this sustainable development project. So it took many years to happen, but eventually we got the glory year, if you like, of multilateralism, where we had the signing of the SDGs in 2015 in September, and then in December we had the signing of the Paris Agreement. Okay, now I'm going a little slowly here, so I'll share the slides, but one thing I just want to point out is very gradually stakeholders have been invited into the deliberations of the dialogues in the UN, you know, General Assembly, UN Economic and Social Council, Human Rights Commission, and so on. And where did this come from? Okay, and it really came from the Earth Summit back in '92, where they've had many meetings where the scientists and heads of government all agreed that there was a problem, and they'd come up and they knew how to fix it and they knew where the solutions were. But somehow when they went home to their capitals, as they say, or to their countries, nothing was really done. So what they felt was important is that this could not be done by government alone, and that you had to empower the other stakeholders. And in a sense, so the Agenda 21 was the first time where in these, particularly Commission on the Environment, where these major groups were started to be invited into dialogues in the General Assembly, right? So you could wonder, why did Greta Thunberg get to speak at, you know, the COP and make her famous speeches, etc.? But why is because NGOs and academia and youth and women groups and worker unions, etc., and corporates had the right to make statements, 2-minute statements. And this came from Agenda 21, where there was suddenly a desire to hold governments to account at a more global level, to invite the stakeholders in, particularly NGOs and academics and women groups, so that, and the other thing, it would empower these stakeholders when they go home, that they would say, well, we saw you making these commitments at a global level. Now we're going to work with you and hold you to account to implement them at a national level and, you know, kind of national level and even local level. So I just want to emphasize the importance of the Earth Summit in recognizing that this has to be a whole of society endeavor, that you will never move to sustainable development if you do not get the help and the buy-in of corporates, of civil society, of academia, and so on. Governments cannot do this alone. They will never achieve this alone. There has to be a joint up thinking or a whole of society approach. But the beginning of civil society's participation or stakeholder participation can be there, and you see it there in Agenda 21 in 1992. In Rio +20, this got actually more aggressive. And there's this quite amazing piece of the UN General Assembly Resolution 67290 was quite transformative in that it actually gave entities or NGOs and universities and corporates, they gave them rights. And these rights included under the Economic and Social Council to get consultative status, and under what's called the HLPF, this is the High Level Political Forum, which is the body which reviews all what happened in the SDGs across governments and stakeholders, like the voluntary national reviews, but also by all stakeholders every year in July. And it's under the General Assembly actually every 4 years, and under the Economic and Social Council every year. But stakeholders had the right to attend meetings, the right to submit documentation, to intervene in meetings, to make oral statements, to make reference to organize side events and roundtables and other such like. And I'm sure you've all maybe participated in these things, you know, in the UN Youth Forum and these things. So for example, you should watch out for the engagement day of the Transforming Education Summit on September 16th, because again, youth and undergraduates are invited to, I say virtually, and even to attend in person to discuss transforming education or achieving the same development goal 4. But this is just, I'm just highlighting a big change in who's the duty bearer. The duty bearer is the Stakeholder Partnership. Stakeholder partnerships have been getting rights at a global level to attend and intervene and participate in agenda setting and follow up and review at kind of global meetings. And then we can go into countries like Finland and Ireland and the UK and, you know, across the world, there's debates about how youth and how stakeholders can have a voice in the bureaucratic side of governments, in the parliamentary side of governments. There's environmental climate action cases been taken by solicitors for young people and civil society to bring governments to court for not implementing the Paris Agreement. This happened in Ireland, where Andrew Jackson, who's an environmental lawyer in UCD, on behalf of civil society, brought the Irish government to court because they were not implementing the Paris Agreement. Their climate mitigation plan was not good enough, and they won that action, and they made the government redo its climate action plan and to build in pathways and targets explicitly for every sector and people. And this is something that happened in Holland. It's starting to happen in Germany. There's cases in Indonesia. I think there's cases in the US. But it just shows you, again, this idea that non-governmental folks or civil society are trying to change the bureaucratic side of government, the jurisdiction side of government, the parliamentary side of government, and they're not just protesting outside, they're looking to actually have an influence on the institutions of government themselves and make them what we call open government, or to give stakeholder voices in the setting of agendas and other things. So this is quite a big movement that's happening. But in the UN, there is an explicit General Assembly resolution, which is the foundation of allowing non-governmental stakeholders to actually participate in all the meetings of the UN in New York and Geneva and Paris and so on. So in today's language, these are the major groups. So I'm a member of the science and technology community. Obviously, you could be part of the women group or the children and youth group, or even the academic community, why not? And these actually have a seat at the table, literally. They're secretariat support, and they have been, they're an interesting force for change, and it's not that they hold governments to account at a global level. When they go back to their capitals, they're also pushing the government to implement the promises that were made at these global meetings. So the post-2015 process, just some key things in the work programs. One was the work by the Open Working Group. So political scientists amongst you would be interested to know that the Open Working Group was not, normally the UN divides itself into 6 political parties, like regional groupings. But the Open Working Group actually took a random draw across countries. And so suddenly you would have groupings talking about the oceans, That could be like the SIDS and Fiji in with Ireland, etc. And that's why the Open Working Group actually came up with these 17 goals and 169 targets, which were largely unchanged actually in the intergovernmental negotiations. But they actually, how they came about was not through the normal political process in the UN. They actually changed into more kind of random groupings of countries to actually have deliberations on the post-2015 agenda, which we know as the SDGs. The other thing was there was a huge the biggest consultative process ever of stakeholders. And the one, even though it doesn't sound like a bottom-up process, because it's called the high-level panel of eminent people, that one actually consults a lot of companies and a lot of NGOs. And they came up with the terms like leave no one behind. They came up with things like whole of government, whole of society approaches. So it is kind of worth reading that document, the high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 agenda, because you'll see a lot of the principles and a lot of these discussions that are now present that came from that document. And of course, SDSN was the academic and legal oversight of all of these things, and they had their imprint on what happened in the intergovernmental negotiations that happened. So could major groups, or did major groups have an impact on this document? Yes, I would say the UN has a digital library now. So again, political scientists here as an undergrad, you could go into the UN library and you could look at all the statements of the major groups, map them into the different kind of stages of the outcome document of the 2030 agenda, and just to see whether, you know, women's groups or whatever had any influence whatsoever on the outcome document. Like David Donoghue and Kamau in their books made it clear that the major groups had a very big impact on the negotiations on the outcome, because it was everyone accepted it without any sort of correction or opt-outs, and people they adopted it actually in August 9th, when, you know, sometimes these things are not only adopted like hours before the actual heads of state sign it in say September. But I think one of the reasons why the major groups do have influence is that normally the major groups, the UN regional groupings like the EU, for example, or the G77 and China, like these groupings tend to have a common approach. So if you have a one issue, like say the science issue, or you could be a women's group or women's issues, you really are a one issue desk, and all you have to do is convince the regional groupings, which is 5. It's not that you have to convince 193 countries. It doesn't work that way, right? You just, you basically convince the political parties, which are the UN regional groupings. So I think that's why there was such an impact of the presence of major groups in the intergovernmental negotiations of the SDGs. And feminists have looked at that document where they say the goals and targets are not really that well written from a feminist point of view, because they largely took it from previous legal agreements and from the Open Working Group. But they say the text, which had principles and follow-up and review and the means of implementation, etc., is a really solid document from a feminist kind of point of view. And again, that was because of the lobbying, the day-to-day lobbying of the women's group on each of the paragraphs and the sentences and their impact on the regional groupings. So like I'm saying, everyone should have a read of Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, because it's actually a very well-written document, and it does have, you know, a preamble, a vision, and a narrative, right? So there is a vision there, and there are principles there that are worth looking at. You probably know the 17 goals and 169 targets, but it also has a section on the means of implementation, which you should focus on, because the work programs of the UN focus on them a lot. And what they are is finance, data, technology, education, partnerships. These are the means of which are the levers or the enablers of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And there is a governance piece about follow-up and review. There's a very clear academic sense of voluntary national reviews, meaning countries volunteer to present what they have done on global indicators that are SDG indicators that have been signed off by every country as a baseline. They say, well, what have we achieved through a voluntary national review? And even though it's not legally binding, we all know from an academic sense, when you have to get up in class and present in front of your peers, that is a discipline, right? That it does have an impact on people trying to show that they are responsible and they have made some progress on the SDGs. So there is this explicit, through the HLPF, there's an explicit follow-up and review process that happens. And it's interesting to read how that works in this Transforming the World 2030 Agenda. Paragraph 52 is actually quite important. They, believe it or not, so I worked for SDSN, obviously up to 2014. And then as part of the major group for science and technology, I sat in on the 9 months representing academia in a sense. But academia was mentioned 15 times at one stage in the document. But by the end, it was only mentioned 1 or 3 times. And I think there was a big pushback against certain countries. Certain countries did not want academia mentioned as part of the stakeholder partnership. I don't know, you can imagine, like in Malawi, for example, Chancellor's College was shut down. Like when Trump was in power, he was trying to shut down Berkeley. You know, so a lot of leaders just see academia as a threat in some respect. But the work was done to make sure, this term academia here, academic community, the work was done that in paragraph 52, which is what the stakeholder partnership is, governments and parliaments and United Nations system and intergovernmental systems and the major groups, etc., and the science and academic community. So this empowers, obviously, the academic community to do something for the goals. This is why you're here today. And also it empowers a lot of universities in the Times Higher Education, SDG rankings, for example, are taking things seriously. But it makes them a formal stakeholder, and academics have been very good at actually doing the project. And one thing I would say is that even though governments have found it problematic, America pulling back from the Paris Agreement, not funding the UN, not participating properly in the HLPF, that caused a problem for the UN, because instead of actually developing the goals and the agenda more, the policy was to hold what you have. It was just make sure this does not go backwards. And that was nearly the first 5 years. But having said that, and obviously we've had COVID, and now we have different conflict issues, people driving towards different sort of conflicts around the world. But we'd have to say that academics and elements of the private sector and elements of the civil society have been actually very good on the SDGs. And that in terms of a project, it has a huge sort of impact and understanding and people across the non-governmental, let's say, stakeholders are actually making a lot of progress on the SDGs. This is just, if you wanted a taxonomy on the 17 goals, here is like the first 7 are like the expanded MDG goals. These are the new explicit economic goals, just asking economic and cities and economic development to be inclusive and environmentally sustainable. These are the environmental goals, and then we have the governance goals. But the project stress, and this is true of all the targets, that it is an indivisible project. So all of the goals have to be achieved, or targets have to be achieved simultaneously. You don't cherry pick and pick one goal over another. That is not the essence of the project. And there's very clear means of implementation. So there's a big focus on finance for sustainable development, and there's a new committee now for that under Guterres. There's a big getting finance into middle and low income countries. There's a big push on technology for sustainable development, or technology for good, and transferring technology from the northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere. A big focus on SDG education, or sorry, SDG data. So we have good data, you know, economic data. We might have good household data. Maybe we have good geo data for environment, but we don't have good integrated data. Like, we don't have information on a university or on a corporate firm where we can see the environmental, the social, and the economic data by a region or by a company or by a landmass. Like, so our data is not that integrated, and it is a problem for planning. If you ask a government to plan, integrate a sustainable development pathway, they actually don't have data that integrates that. So there's a lot of work to be done on getting SDG data, to be honest. A lot of work to be done in partnerships, because governments are just starting to get used to the idea of allowing stakeholders to be part of agenda setting and follow up and review, but it's happening. Science policy interface. This is the idea that science is not getting into policy quick enough. So there's an attempt through committees, through reports, to the nature of reporting to get science into policy. These are big areas. Transforming education is a big thing. A lot of us went through school, even through university, where we had no idea. Like, I would have to admit, I didn't know for most of my life that 50% of the oxygen I breathe comes from the ocean. You know, so here you are walking around breathing oxygen, and you don't understand how important the ocean is. And this is true for most of humanity. That does not make any sense, right? Why is this not taught in preschool? Why do children not understand how they need clean water, clean air, nutritious food, and what actually drives that? How do they not understand that when you buy commodities and goods, that you're in some ways energy systems, etc., that you're somehow interconnected with people all over the world who actually produce these goods on value chains, etc. So your imprint on other humans and on nature is absolutely enormous, but most of us just don't understand for lots of that. So the thing about SDG education is that a lot of corporates and a lot of, let's call older people, have to go back to school. They've got to upskill, and we have to transform for younger people, not just in university, but through to preschool and in the lower levels of schooling. They've got to get sustainable development education, and you have to mainstream an understanding of how you coexist with humanity and how you coexist with planet in your curriculum and education. And the follow-up and review process is really the governance process. Like, so where at local level, even inside a university or inside a corporation, at governance level, who's setting the ESG standards? Who's setting the baselines in corporate? So in terms of a university, like, who has the KPIs? Who is saying what are we going to do in terms of our environmental objectives in our strategic planning, both in our research, our education, the campus, the funding. Like, so you have to get rid of fossil fuel, try to bring in renewable energies onto the campus, do research in these areas, educate in all these areas. So governance has to change quite a lot, not just in government. It has to change inside a household, which is informal, but change inside corporates, inside universities, because your whole way of your board and your planning and your statutes and your targets and your reporting and your baselines, they have to incorporate what you're doing for society and the environment. And if not, then you have a real problem, because you'll end up just those who are like you guys are dedicated to this, but you're not saying you're on your own because you have each other, but you're working against the system. You're working against the actual institution inside your own university or inside your government or inside your local authority or with the corporates you're dealing with or the banks you're dealing with. So this sort of reform of institutions is actually very important, actually, and work has been, and that's an MOI, obviously. Just this is the key science policy interface document the UN works with is called the Global Sustainable Development Report. And that, I think the last one of that is in 2019. There's another one coming out this September, I think, or 23 maybe. So I think it's next year, 23. And this is all about how we get science into policy quicker. The UN Technology Facilitation Mechanism is all about, and it's interesting to look at TFM 2030 Connect there. It's about how people can take patents and technology and get them transferred in a Creative Commons, etc., across nations. And in fact, we've one project where we want to take curriculum of universities, people who are doing courses on sustainable development, to put a Creative Commons license on them and actually transfer them into the libraries of universities across the world, where they can be updated and translated and put in the local context and culture, etc. But there's a lot of work happening where you can transfer intellectual property and to start avoiding what happened with COVID-19, because the governments paid the universities to come up with the vaccine, like AstraZeneca and Oxford. Then Oxford signed away the intellectual property to a private company. Then the private company sells it back to the government in an expensive way. And then it's too expensive for kind of low and middle income countries to get the vaccine and distribute. This was crazy. This was a public good. It was created by taxpayers' money. It should have been a global public good. The intellectual property should have belonged to the world. It should have been copied and distributed rapidly throughout the world to deal with COVID-19. But this is true of intellectual property on education, on research, on patents, and this is wrong, right? In the future, when the governments and taxpayers pay for intellectual property or research or technology, we have to learn to make it a global public good and to put a Creative Commons license on it and to allow it to be reused and updated and adapted to different parts of the world. And this is effectively what the technology facilitation mechanism is trying to do, to transfer technologies as rapidly as you can across the world to achieve sustainable development. So in summary, we have an agenda that is universal. Every country has to do it. And the word transformative is very important because, it's not a transition. It's not that existing structures, existing people, existing corporates, let's call it the business as usual, have to transition towards sustainable development. It's very likely that companies will exit, other companies will come in, workers will have to be reallocated, different skills into different sectors. Transformation means entry-exit. It means actually a structural change. And of course, politically, this makes life difficult. So to move from energy that's fossil fuel-based to energy that's renewable, come on, this is different technologies, it's different companies, it's different value chains, it's different everything, right? That's a transformation, right? Now, transition can be part of the story. I mean, obviously, gas and oil companies can get more efficient in terms of emissions, etc. And as the transformation happens, there's maybe a role of transition. But that's just to be careful. When we talk about sustainable development, we talk about, now they talk about 6 transformations, the transformation of the economic system, in the energy systems, and so on and so forth, right? In cities and so on and so forth. So, but transformation is a very different word to transition. The agenda, again, because of cherry picking, and it did happen in the Millennium Development Goal Project, where it said 50% of the 1990 level, like goal 1 of Millennium Development Goal is to reduce your poverty level by 50% of your 1990 level. But what 50%? And a lot of countries went for the easy target. They didn't really reach to the poorest. They didn't reach to the furthest behind. And that's why this principle of leaving no one behind is that you've got to, in your policies, when you think of societal policies, is to reach to the poorest first and then to come back. And it's an important principle. The agenda is universal and indivisible. So all countries and all the goals simultaneously. And some people, like economists, like to show a thing called donut economics. And the idea is that, can we have an economic system that is consistent with providing, let's call it social protection floors, like ILO, the International Labour Organization, and can we stay within Rockstrom's planetary boundaries? In a sense, this is where we want to get to. Where we are is, I think you can take that donut and you can crumple it. And the job we have is to put all those crumbs together to recreate this donut, because on every economic policy, on every step, we have to integrate environmental and social issues and to recreate this sort of donut. Because at the moment, it's very clear a lot of economic policy, and let's be honest, a lot of the value added that's created around the world from value chains actually depends on inequality. In other words, cheap labor. It depends on exploiting the environment and not having rules around pollution or, carbon or water footprints. So in a sense, the whole economic structure is upheld with, say, a fossil fuel industry and so on. So to recreate an economic system that can create the same value added in jobs and prosperity that is kind to society and environment is a real transformation that has to be put back together. But it's an interesting, a very popular idea, donut economics, but this is where you want to get to. It's not where we are. The wedding cake, the scientists like to say, you got to restore and rebuild your ecosystem in terms of, your land, air, and water quality, and then you build that first, and then you build your societal outcomes, and on top of that, your economic and your institutions. I don't think that's the wedding cake analysis is not a good one, because you have to achieve all things simultaneously, and they're all equally important. And why I kind of say this is that, you can set aside land and sea, and they're trying to do this. Unfortunately, they failed yesterday to do this on the high seas, to set aside the high sea for nature. The reality is we coexist with nature, and we have to learn to coexist with nature. So we've to adapt our economic and social and political systems to coexist with nature and build them together. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that, smash the cake up, rebuild it, and have a sense of where your political, economic, and social systems coexist with nature. And you've got to start thinking how that can be possible. Otherwise, you go on what's called the half Earth. This is the famous Harvard, I think his name is E.O. Wilson. He's a famous Harvard biodiversity person, where he goes, humans have to get off half the land and half the seas, half Earth, and that way we'll have sustainability in our food systems and in our economics and societies. But we literally have to put nature on 50% of the Earth, and humans have to be on the other 50% of the Earth. And this is this idea of set aside. But I think that's politically difficult to do that. But also in reality, humans just have to learn, like Indigenous people, you've got to learn how to coexist with nature and create, like, to be what you say is, a lot of religions talk about us as having stewards. We're stewards of the common home. We actually have to mind it, and we have to pass it on to future generations in as good a condition as we found it. So in a sense, learning how to create positive linkages to nature in the way we do things, rather than living off or destroying nature the way we're doing it, okay? And in reality, the goals, the targets of the Sdg Agenda are like this. This was done by UN DESA, where they did a text analysis of each of the goals, and they looked at the targets, and they were looking at the actual text linkages of the targets to the different goals across the system. And this was the idea, you had an education goal, you had an employment goal, like there, Sdg 8, this was Sdg 10, Sdg 9, Sdg 16. And then what they did is, in the targets, how do they link across the linkages across the different goals? And the agenda is very like this. It's asking people to, in each of your endeavors in building institutions and building education or gender empowerment, of health systems, of renewable energy systems, water systems, just know the linkages across the sort of economic, social, and governance pillars and environmental pillars as a result of what you're doing. And to get what's called this integral ecology, where human development nature is actually flourishing because you understand the linkages and the interdependencies, which are quite complex. But the world we live in is already complex, but it's just building weapons and driving war and nuclear, that's complex as well. So humanity has to put its energies and its investment and its intellectual power into understanding how all these targets are interlinked to create this integral ecology, as people call it. So these are pathways. People are trying to simplify the agenda, like pathways to sustainable development. The scientists are talking about key levers like institutions and finance and partnerships and science, and how they drive themselves into protecting the global environmental commons, our food systems, our energy systems, our economic systems, our health and education systems, our planning at a local level. And this is kind of useful. It's just putting a planning and like, so in our environmental action plan, we more or less, in Ireland, we more or less map into these 6 sectors or plans and put the sort of emission targets, and then we invest money into these levers to try and achieve the targets on these key sort of transformations that have to happen. So it's kind of useful for, I think, economic planning or sustainable development planning at a government level, but it's reductionist at the same time. It's 6 pathways, not 17 goals. It's not 10 levers, but 4 levers, but it can be useful. No one is achieving the goals. The great thing, SDSN, we do the Sdg Dashboard. So every year we've been producing a ranking of countries by the SDGs, and we have a traffic light system of, a dashboard system to indicate who's doing well or not doing well. And obviously red is not good and amber is not good and yellow is only green. The green light is good. But you can see even in the so-called OECD or richer countries that they are not anywhere near achieving the frontiers of sustainable development in any sense. Okay, so there's a huge amount of work to be done. Even Finland and Sweden and other countries who seem to be doing so well are very far away from where they should be. And this is why this agenda is kind of exciting, because it is a global agenda where it's forcing, like for ocean health or for climate change, it's forcing the need for multilateralism, for countries to cooperate, to think about how they can achieve their goals nationally, but how the spillovers come in through their value chains and through the import of fossil fuels, etc. So it actually highlights the whole spillover and interdependencies, and it highlights that rich countries are not doing, they're doing very poorly, particularly on the environmental issues. And of course, other countries are having maybe more problems in social issues, but it is an agenda for every country. It's universal. It points towards multilateralism. It points towards the need of cooperation across nations, etc. Okay, so I'll go a little faster and then I'll take questions. Now, like I said before, that's what the agenda is. This is an analysis that was, let's say 2015. The reality of what's happened since 2015 is that people have talked about dystopian threats or kind of pathways to the dystopia, to problematic pathways to versus these sustainable development possibilities. And the 4 dystopian threats that are highlighted by the General Secretary is that we're not going the right direction in the environment. Like obviously we're looking at global warming across the world at the moment. It seems to be, over 30, 40 Celsius everywhere, like not just one country, but everywhere for the last few months, which is very unusual. So climate change is here. It's happening much faster than we thought it would, largely because Rockstrom has said that only now are they modeling the absorptive capacity of the ocean. The ocean actually acted as a stabilizer for carbon. When there was too much carbon in the air, the ocean had a capability to absorb carbon. But now the ocean is getting warmer as well, and it's not acting as that stabilizer. So suddenly the global warming is happening at an exponential pathway. It's even more than was predicted by scientists in 2015, and that's a problem, right? Biodiversity, extinction is happening a lot faster. Like, look at these fires. Like, they're really destroying biodiversity at a speed which is unthinkable. Pollution, air pollution is happening in a very bad rate. The zoonotic diseases like COVID-19, like when you destroy habitats and you expose humans to nature, like you will get transfer of diseases from animals to humans as zoonotic diseases, which COVID-19 is. But that's what Ebola is, that's what malaria is, that's what HIV was, you know. So this is a monkeypox. This is happening on a larger scale as well. We've never been as poor on education, particularly with COVID-19. Kids out of school, we're not doing well with education, participation and learning. There's a digital divide happening across the world in terms of what's happening with technologies. And there is, let's say, ethnicity issues that you can identify very clearly within countries and across countries which groups are doing less well compared to others, and inequality is getting worse. Poverty is getting worse. The threat of famine is getting worse. Conflict is getting, like breaks of conflict is getting worse. And obviously, there's the fear of war now with geopolitics around Ukraine and Taiwan, etc. This kind of escalation of money into security and into cyber security, etc. Money that could be used for sustainable development, right? So when you think of in Ukraine, when these soldiers use a javelin for a tank, you know, they go around in groups like guerrilla warfare, they shoot off a javelin for one tank. That's $180,000. Like, this is, you know, like, what could $180,000 do for people across the world, right? And this is happening every second. There's $180,000 killing people, but literally throwing money away on an escalation of violence rather than pumping it into peace and pumping it into sustainable development across the world, right? But I'm not going to go through the graphs. I think we know we're off track with climate change. We know we have problems with biodiversity. We know we have problems with ocean health. We know we have an escalation in nuclear armament. We know that our food systems are failing because we're too dependent on fossil again and nitrogen and fertilizers. And again, with the lack of the global supply chains and war and etc., like wheat from the Ukraine, we have problems now again with inflation and food and possibility of famine breaking out across different countries, because famine always breaks out when you have commodity price boom, particularly during periods of conflict. I mean, this is exactly where famines come from, right? Matthias N's analysis of Bengal and so on. Somalia is the same. When the financial crisis led to an explosion in commodity price boom. Somalia exports all its food. It has famine in the first famine of the 21st century. Inequality is getting worse, and so on and so forth. And this is just, I should update this slide, but the Institute for Economics and Peace in Europe always does a guesstimate of the global spend on security. And if you just think about, you know, it's gone up now, right? So I think it's nearly 16 trillion. Like the SDG project by the IMF and World Bank and SDSN say we need about 3 trillion a year to invest in sustainable development pathways globally, right? But we already spend up to 15 or 16 trillion a year on security and militarization, right? So a simple solution is take the money out of security and militarization and allocate it towards sustainable development, and the world will be fine. Because, you know, peace and sustainability means future conflict is gone. It's like a vaccine to future conflict. But if you allow current conflict to have more investment in militarization and security, then you're just going to have a pathway to conflict. And you're going to have destruction of peace processes and not investment, obviously, in sustainable development pathways. And it's just a vicious circle, right? And in a sense, one of the common agenda principles at the moment is that, you know, it was difficult to bring the peace goal, or SDG 16, into the agenda, because a lot of people in the Security Council said we don't want to mix what happens in the Security Council with the General Assembly and Economic and Social Council, right? But the reality is they are interrelated. You know, future peace is driven by investment in sustainable development. And if you don't have peace, you can't have sustainable development. So they have to understand that, you know, pathways to peace are a pathway to sustainable development, and that there's an interrelated work to be done in terms of the work on security and peace and the work on sustainable development, which has now been emphasized very strongly. And some of the work programs in the Security Council reflect that, and vice versa. The work plans in the General Assembly also reflect that as well. But the big thing is finance and money. It's just an incredible amount of money has been spent on securitization and militarization, right? Which we only need a fraction of that to secure sustainable development for everyone globally. And so what I mean by that, of course, is what's called the sustainable development possibilities. And, you know, 3 trillion a year could end poverty, you know, in terms of income poverty, or less than $1 a day, or $1.25 a day. It more or less would give social protection floors to everyone in terms of access to health and education and social protection. It would more or less begin the road of the circular economy, restoration of coral reefs and forestries and biodiversity, you know, in general. It would deal with climate change to try and keep us, you know, below 1.5, which is looking very difficult. And we could have a global approach to protecting ourselves against future and current zoonotic outbreaks of diseases. And it would enhance global peace and, you know, multilateralism and nuclear disarmament, and a move to a world order where the dignity of everyone is respected and every country has a say and everyone contributes to the care of the planet and care of people not in just their own country, but every country, right? So it just seems crazy how 3 trillion a year could give us these outcomes, and somehow humanity is deciding to push against multilateralism, move to nationalism, to move towards militarization and securitization, and to not deal with environmental issues or issues of society in a unilateral sense, or even a bilateral sense with some of the agreements that what they're doing. But again, you know, that's the offering of the, you know, sustainable development can be defined in different ways. You could have other ways to think of the global order, global institutions, no problem. The problem is the UN is the only thing we have. The problem is the UN 2030 Agenda as a moral and a kind of sustainable development plan is the only plan we have. And so therefore, it begs us to work on that and to try and push, you know, in our spheres of influence, both locally and nationally and regionally, to push towards these sustainable development possibilities. Okay. But one thing, and this comes back to education and the need for sustainable development education. In a sense, what we're asking for is a bit more joined up thinking and shared global values coming through our schools and universities, etc. And I'll just leave you with sort of 2 quotes where there are intellectual leaders and people pointing out that, you know, even ancient civilizations like in Greece and China understood the importance of multilateralism and the mutual benefit cooperation amongst countries and to work together for global solutions, protection of the planet. And even John F. Kennedy, you know, in his time when he faced kind of the threat of nuclear war, understood that, listen, you know, we have a basic common link in that we all inhabit the same planet, we breathe the same air. And in fact, if you think of water, which is a finite resource, it actually probably goes through trees and people and stuff over time. So we've all shared, every one of us have kind of shared the common water source over time. Is that we have to kind of understand that we are one planet and one people, and we have to respect and work together to protect planet, and not just people around us, but people everywhere on the planet, right? Okay, so I'll stop there and I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul. And if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand through the reaction buttons and we can take some questions. Professor, if I may ask the first question, you said how it was difficult for the Security Council to acknowledge SDG 16. And also what I realized from your presentation today is that sustainability and achieving sustainability and preventing humanity from going into essential oblivion is a solvable issue if we move away from things like violence and creating wars. And also, I believe it was the day before yesterday where we had the director of the WFP who talked about how petroleum was hijacked in Tigray and they cannot perform humanitarian aid. So how badly does violence and these unstable regions affect SDGs? Because this is basically a humanitarian problem. We are looking at the destruction of our species.
Yeah. Yeah, so unfortunately, I mean, when you look at, there's an interesting background to SDG 16, okay? Because David Donahue, who was the co-facilitator and who wrote that document essentially, and Kamau was a very charismatic person who pulled along, you know, Africa and India and China, like he was a very the G77, etc. So that David Donahue actually was the civil servant who helped get the Good Friday Agreement done in Ireland, the peace process. And when you actually look at some of the principles, let's call them, in SDG 16, they say something kind of very simple, right? Which is, you know, if you want to avoid conflict in a country, your institutions have to guarantee participation of all groupings, right? So for example, you know, in your bureaucratic side of government, so in Northern Ireland, they're saying there has to be equal representation of Catholics and Protestants. In your juracy, you know, the judges and the law, there has to be an equal participation of Catholics and Protestants. In your military and security, your policing, there has to be an equal participation of Catholics and Protestants. In your devolved government or parliament, there has to be an equal participation of Catholics and Protestants. So what it's saying is that a lot of problems happen within countries because let's say their institutions are captured by a minority of interest. Now, this could be an ethnic interest, it could be an economic interest like oil, it could be, you know, any sort of minority grouping. And unfortunately, when you have minority representation, it actually sets the ground for a pathway to conflict. And not obviously internalizing, it's just not representative democracy, basically, right? It's being pushed by agendas of particular entities which are just not serving people in general, right? So I thought that was quite interesting that SDG 16 looks like that, but in a global context, this is true as well. It's not fair in our global institutions of finance, of even in the Security Council with the 5 permanent parties. It's not fair that people in general don't get equal representation, and that their voices are heard throughout global institutions, whether it's to do with financial institutions or Security Council or other things, right? And I think this is, unfortunately, if you don't have good governance and you don't have good representation, this idea of, you know, human rights, leaving no one behind, caring for people in general, not just in your own country, but elsewhere, care for nature, look after nature capital, look after nature in terms of pollutants, etc. You know, obviously, captured institutions are not going to care for those things, you know, and it's a problem. I mean, Russia to me is, you know, I don't want to be political, but in some ways, if it's a communist ideology where, you know, the leaders wanted to look after everyone in Russia and they really felt that the Soviet Union recreation would do that. This is nothing to do with that. This is to do with oil and gas. It's to do with oligarchs who are basically running the gas stations and the oil production in Russia with their agenda, which is not in the interest of anyone, and it's very, very problematic, right? So to answer your kind of question is that in any country at local, national, and regional level, and kind of, let's call it geopolitics, the problem is that we just have underlying kind of lack of good representation in the sort of leadership that we have across the board. And as a result, it kind of underwrites these dystopian threats that were pointed out. And unfortunately, when we look at poverty at the moment and we look at problems and inequality, normally you're either in a conflict situation or a post-conflict situation, right? So this kind of divorcing sustainable development from security and from peace is probably a bit problematic. And now in the world we're living, where the UN itself is trying to keep itself together, it's trying to keep the SDG project and multilateralism together, is realizing that, you know, you've got to work on pathways to peace as much as, and sustainable peace processes, as much as work on pathways to sustainable development. But ironically, pathways to sustainable development are pathways to peace. You know, climate change is going to create social unrest. Social unrest is going to destabilize political systems. It's going to increase security and militarization. So we know they are interrelated. So maybe it's not such a bad idea that the work programs of the Security Council and the Economic and Social Council and General Assembly understand that there's an important link between pathways to sustainable development and pathways to peace and pathways to multilateralism and a new world order. It's not the world order that's trying to minimize the United States and increase the influence of other countries. It's a world order where every person has dignity, every person is respected, every person has a say. And I know it sounds idealistic, but this is the idea, right? The idea is that we should be able to come together, protect the health of the ocean, deal with climate change, make sure our food systems are sustainable, make sure that there isn't exploitation and trafficking of people and organs, and make sure that sustainable, that finance for multinational or the intergovernmental financial, like the World Bank and the IMF, that finance is available to people in all countries and in all sectors and in all communities. It's, you know, the idea that there's a digital divide, a divide in access to finance, a divide in access to technologies like COVID-19. It's just not really that acceptable. I mean, this is actually easily fixable if you define property rights properly and people, in a sense, drive towards good institutions and representative institutions that are clearly trying to fight for the public good nationally, but also for the global public good. So I am linking the political processes and institutions to our ability to make this project work both nationally and internationally.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we have a question from Kelvin, Ambassador from Brazil. You can unmute and you can ask your question.
Hi, hi Patrick, hi Manasha, hi everyone in here. Nice to meet you. I'm Kelvin. I'm a Brazilian ambassador. I'm responsible for the SDG 11. I'm a geography student. My question is about, I want to keep talking about governance because here in Brazil, I'm trying to organize the first SDG encounter of my university. This is going to be the first event only for SDGs and development and sustainable cities and communities. So I have some difficulties in here because when we talk about the SDG 11, we're not just talking about actions. I can see I'm from a favela. I'm a black guy, gay guy from a favela here in Brazil. And I want to just put together the institutes, the organizations. I want to put the scientists, and I want to put it together with people who work on local places too. And most of times, people from local places, like where I came from, don't have the right, how can I say, like the right formation to deal with this, like taking actions, you know. They always have something to do. They already working here on local places, but they don't have the formation to do this. Like they don't see themselves as managers. And most of the times we have to go to the base of everything. When you put that image using the SDG 17 on the top, here in Brazil, I feel that the SDG 17 have to be the base of it, because we can work with the other SDGs when people can't see themselves as a manager and don't have the ways to go through the institutions and don't know how to work with people. They don't know how to go to the places and send emails and write with about those things. So that's my question. I think that sometimes we need to have the education as the base of everything. We have to educate people for management before trying to take actions about the other SDGs, you know? What do you think about it? How can you help me with this experience for me to do this event in November?
So you're absolutely right. Like, so it's a nice way to summarize what I was saying, but to do it from, you know, a more city perspective or devolved perspective. And a lot of what I'm saying is exactly a true education and professional training. And, you know, a lot of people are doing this now in, like, they realize even in the UN system itself, there's a lot of upskilling and learning happening, you know, and it's education is the tool. So it's not just schooling, but it's, you know, redoing what's happening in universities, but also executive training and professional training, you know, for training of government people, etc. And it's right. It's for changing their values and their knowledge and their understanding of what has to be done, right? So this is where I think I'd answer your question, is that, you know, if there is a national plan, even though a lot of money, and Brazil, I think, is a bit like this, you know, there is a bit of devolution down to local level, and you know, people actually can make decisions for themselves in a city. You know, there still has to be a national plan. There still has to be a kind of national targets, etc. But there is no doubt that when it comes down to it, urban areas and cities, you know, could be the drivers of the transformation. And a lot of people are thinking about, you know, housing and infrastructure and moving to renewable energies, and they actually can see how it's done, but they get very frustrated on, you know, the lack of commitment or understanding of different stakeholders. And in fact, in Europe now we have this thing called moonshots. This is the idea of, you know, when they decided to go to the moon, what happened to actually get to the moon, they had the mission, but they actually needed help across different stakeholders, which they couldn't even imagine that they needed help. So it was a whole of society effort to get the, you know, the man to the moon. But it's the same idea in a city, that there has to be this mission and a coalition across stakeholders who understand what they're doing, and that has to be empowered and in some way funded and supported. But the actual knowledge, like when you go through city planning and you look at the different pathway projects for cities, is that, again, the frustrating thing is that it could be done, and it actually doesn't look that difficult. But the political will has to be there, the knowledge has to be there, the mission has to be there, and maybe it's part of a national objective, and cities nearly compete against each other to be the most sustainable city, you know, in SDG 11. And so SDSN for the US actually does a state level pathways to sustainable development, and there's a lot of city level pathways that are and projects that are being developed because of this reason. So it's a great project. It's right to be led out of the university, But yes, it's so the thing that's difficult is getting the knowledge and the political will behind it, because it actually is very doable. And Brazil, a lot of the South American countries, you know, they understand a bit better how they should be coexisting with nature. It's more in their past. Also, solidarity, as we call it from Paul, I don't know what you call it in South, like there seems to be an understanding how communities should work together. So they have that heritage. In a sense, that heritage actually found itself through Colombia and other countries, and Brazil as well, into the Rio +20 documents. It was South America that was very responsible for that, for the future we want. So yeah, I think you're doing a very exciting project, and it's hard. I mean, transformations are hard, but I think what you said to me is the one lesson I'm trying to say here is don't underestimate governance and institutions. You know, they are nearly the platform where there has to be kind of political will and knowledge and acceptance that the governance piece has to be there. It's because you're probably a planner. You have to have planning, you have to have the legal frameworks, you know, they have to be there to actually execute this. And so putting governance at the side or at the top is wrong, actually. You know, and I think that's what you said to me. I agree with you.
Thank you very much. I hope the professor answered your question. Just an announcement to everyone, please keep your questions short, as we are accommodating over 100 people and we're trying to ask everyone's questions. Let me move to the chat box. We have one question from Riha. Girls and women are disproportionately affected by the present world crisis. What can be done?
Yeah. So there is no doubt when there are problems like war or COVID-19 or, you know, food, inflation and food prices, somehow it's always women who are disproportionately affected and hurt the most. And it largely comes from, again, kind of stressing, you know, the equal participation of women right from the beginning in schooling, in political systems and economic systems, etc. Do you know what I mean? So when you actually are not, when you're somehow excluded from that, you know, from finance, you have a dependency on things, and unfortunately they may have a greater aptitude to care for the environment and people, that then they're going to suffer the most. So there is no doubt that, you know, a big success of this project, again in representation, is to make sure, and women and all ethnic groups and age groups, but women obviously is 50% of the population, so it's very serious, that they have to have equal participation. In other words, the second division human rights have to be absolutely guaranteed for women in terms of participation in politics and economy and all the elements, economy and society, etc. The hope is, of course, is that with greater women participation, that they would make more decent, like they would have a tendency not to go to war, not to go to spend more on health and social issues, environmental issues, rather than, you know, investing in I don't know, technologies that are for the oil industry and not for sustainable development. Part of me thinks, though, that we do live in a hierarchical system, and it is kind of crazy how one man or a small group of men make all the decisions, because that actually excludes 80% or 90% of men who find themselves equally as a disadvantaged in a lot of respects. So what I'm trying to get at here is system change more important than representation? Now, because there's people in Taiwan, for example, a digital minister that shows, like, there was a time when you didn't have technology and phones, and it made sense that the chief of the village would come to the center to talk about policy, or, you know, to sign off or to protect the village's interests. But now with communication and technologies, in a sense, you can have a 24/7 open a consultative to consultation when everyone can have a say. There's no need for one person to be in charge. There's no need for an executive committee to be in charge. So maybe we have to do a bit of rethinking, particularly now that there's a few people in charge of whether you decide to use nuclear weapons or not. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? That 7 billion people on the planet, and we can narrow it down to 2 or 3 people who can decide to blow up the planet or not. That's a failure in our system and hierarchical system and governance, actually. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, empowering women is really important. Empowering everyone is really important in terms of representation and access, you know, economic rights like land ownership, the right to own land, to get pure rent from land, to transfer land. We all know that that's a problem for women in lots of countries. They don't have inheritance rights, etc. So absolutely, they have to have all the economic, like Amartya Sen, all the economic and political and social freedoms. Everyone should have them. And they should be part of our, you know, political institutions, our government institutions, or institutions in corporates or inside universities. But we still have to think about the way we set up the system in terms of decision-making and executive power, because that is becoming very problematic. So even if women had the same status as men in this system, maybe you'd still get one woman leader and, you know, 50% men, 50% women in an executive, and who's to say that they're not as ruthless as some of the leaders that we're seeing at the moment, right? So the Conservative leader at the moment, Tush, she'll be a woman, but she's very right-wing, and like she openly said, "I'm not afraid to use a nuclear weapon. I'm not particularly a friend of Cameroon, you know, her NATO ally in France." So, and I don't think women should be given the responsibility of, you know, they always have to be kind to nature and kind to society, because they're individuals like everyone else. So there's no reason why they should be. So that's why I'm saying system change is probably as important as individual freedoms. But no doubt working on gender empowerment would be a massive improvement from where we are, and a big plus for the project. But I still think we've got to think about how we get more kind of representative and kind of more less executive systems going on in our democracies or decision makings across the world.
Thank you, Professor. I believe we have Abdul. He has a question. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. Please be mindful to keep your question short due to time constraints. Abdul, you can go ahead. Perhaps he is not there. One of the questions we have is from Sailesh. How do you hold corporations accountable as their greed sees no end? We often leave them. There are more golf courses in the world than solar parks.
Yeah. So again, you know, this goes back to governance, right? So there's a very simple narrative, I don't know whether you guys use it or not, about neoliberalism, right? Which is, you know, a world which governments kind of step aside and they allow free markets, you know, free movement of goods, free movement of capital, and so on. And they kind of stand back from corporates, right? But the way I see it is, you know, corporates are only one step away from governance all the time. You know, you've got to get visas or licenses, or you pay taxes or don't pay taxes, or, you know, so in a sense, government policy, even as an enabler, underwrites corporations. Even in this neoliberal sense, they're underwritten, right? So if corporations are destroying the planet and not paying taxes, and as you say, you know, spending on golf courses rather than, you know, renewable energy systems through their global supply chain, it's really because our regulatory authorities and the oversight from government is actually really poor. We're not saying to the global value chains that you have to change the nature of your board of governance, your ESG standards, like environmental side government standards, your reporting systems, taxing them properly, and so on and so forth, right? So, and even consumers who buy their goods and services don't seem to take responsibility for the fact that there's such, social and environmental footprints on all the goods that you buy. There's such, so in theory, you can work out from all the goods that you buy what the sort of climate footprint, emission footprint is, even ethical, social footprints, and so on and so forth, with clothes and with food, etc. So, and even if consumers don't, governments could step in and they could say, there's a requirement on packaging to actually tell you exactly what your footprints are, etc. And even design taxes that actually tax people more when they're importing and using processed goods or goods that are quite environmentally intensive, etc. Right? So, in the end of the day, so I'm being very Keynesian here, right? In the sense that the nature of demand, whether it's government buying products, and services from the private sector to build roads, to build infrastructure, digital infrastructure, etc., or us as consumers when we buy goods and services, in a sense, we have the responsibility to say that we want products and services that are sustainable and don't have these footprints. And the minute we do that, the government or the corporations to sell their goods have to change their policies and their product lines and their production lines, etc. Right? So what I'm trying to say is there's a supply side comment here about corporations just don't do the right thing. They're not there for money. They're not incentivized to do the right thing. And that is true. They're not developing technologies in an appropriate way. And they're, probably using government assets and being quite exploitive and not paying taxes and not contributing. But it's the responsibility of consumers and government to make sure that that doesn't happen, and a set of regulatory policies and government policies can actually ensure that all corporates have to do this, So, governments can move to renewable energies very quickly if they really want to. Excuse me for that.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have quite a few questions. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, this will be our last. I will be selecting Aloysius from Malaysia, University of Malaya. He would like to inquire how the International Court of Justice plays an important role in maintaining peace among nations and what other stakeholders should be involved.
Yeah, so I like where that question is going, in the sense that, like, we all know that what I'm trying to say is that legal structures actually do matter, right? So even dictators in Africa in history, they actually care. Like when they say they want to be a lifelong leader, they actually change the constitution. But if there is any issues with being called out by the UN Security Council or human rights abuses or so on and so forth, like it does act as a discipline on members and countries. There is no doubt. But the reality is, though, and I'm not an expert, obviously, on legal structures as much as I should be, but the reality is that the legally binding structures, what I call interstate, even on the flow of goods and services that allows multinationals run riot, but on the regulation of the use of the high seas, on the regulation of human rights abuses or international law on, the sovereignty and boundary of countries, it's there, and it potentially can be very powerful, but at the moment I think it's quite weak. And that's a problem for us when we want kind of global order and a bit of cooperation across countries, and we want accountability to something. When countries are not doing right. Unfortunately, the global institutions are weak, and in some ways the UN is weak. It's really a place for global dialogue, which is handy. At least people are talking and around the table. It has a few instruments you know, that potentially, you know, can hold people to account. But in reality, and it's working towards legal frameworks for the high seas and the oceans. It's working towards, has a framework on climate, for example, with the Paris Agreement. But the reality is that we're regulating, you know, the sort of impact, the international kind of the impact of global institutions that try to, in a sense, have coalitions of countries trying to discipline the bad behavior of one country. This is actually quite weak. But again, I like what you're saying in the sense that, you know, in the economic sphere, but with global value chains, in the social sphere with kind of migration and climate refugees and refugees from war and other things, conflict, around justice and juracy and like we do seem to need stronger global institutions, and whether they get their power from decentralized coordination, which Joe Stiglitz talks about, there doesn't seem to be you know, an appetite to have true global institutions that would give you like more power over the national country. But this can be done with kind of multilateral agreements. So you're right. I don't think the role is good at the moment, but it's something that should be worked on and made more effective and quicker. But it's a tough area, yeah.
Final question, Professor. This is from Madison. She wants to hear about the intergenerational dialogue that may help contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and how young people can take initiative to achieve this goal.
Yeah. So I've forgotten the in what's called the call for action, or in the preamble of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Even though youth are not mentioned really in the targets and goals, which is interesting, they are mentioned quite a lot in this the visionary statement or the call for action. But what's interesting when you look at the paragraphs is they talk more about intergenerational cooperation, actually. So the way I kind of look at this is that clearly the Secretary General at the moment, he's going to change the trusteeship chamber, which is a vestigial chamber, into an I can't remember, it's an intergenerational chamber. He wants to, you know, rather than youth participating in the major groups or in the UN Youth Forum, to actually give them their own chamber or council, you know, which is good, and to kind of have a report, an intergenerational report, and put more emphasis on and respect more the views of those who are kind of younger, right? But the reality is that to get this job done, it's like, I think universities are very naturally a place where older and younger people talk. I mean, if you think about what actually happens in a university, it's an ongoing dialogue between young and older people, talking about policy, talking about politics, talking about all science, talking about all these things. And in a sense, what comes out in curriculum and in papers and PhDs is a result of an intergenerational dialogue. And I think that's why when we talk about getting young people, you know, represented in the institutions of government, or getting young people represented in the UN properly and into the deliberations of, let's say, the Transforming Education Summit, the tests that's happening, and there's clear pathways for engagements for youth. It's much more powerful when, let's say, for example, when I talked about, you know, I'll give you one example. So you had Greta Thunberg kind of, I would call, this is what the Americans call good trouble, you know, kind of demonstrating and striking outside the parliaments to show that, you know, we know the science is there, it's up to the older people to implement the policies, and we're not going to go to school, we're demonstrating, and, you know, and it's disobedience, and it's, you know, civil society trying to put pressure on the parliamentary side of the legislators to do something, right? But what was different with, say, the climate action case is this is where you had older people who were solicitors, lawyers, people with money, who worked with the young people to actually take the Irish government to court because they were not in their climate mitigation plan. They were not actually ever going to meet the targets and the pathways to the climate emissions required by the Paris Agreement. So there's an example of kind of intergenerational cooperation where they were actually working inside the jurisy aspect and actually putting pressure on the legislator. In the sense, the legislator normally just separation of powers between jurisy and parliament. In this case, the judges decided that the legislators had to redo the climate action plan and to build in the targets and the pathways that are appropriate. Now, they're still struggling to put the law into practice, as I say, but it just shows you, you know, it's not one generation of the other. I think there are future generations who are not born yet that depend on all of us getting together, you know, whether young and old, you know, the older people have daughters and sons, they have grandchildren, they want this to work as well, right? So I think if I was a young person, you know, you could demonstrate inside a university in a students' union, or you could decide to form committees with the academics and actually start in subcommittees of academic council and the board of governance and demand a seat at the table, demand that this is on the strategic planning, demand that this is in the budgetary process. So you could actually start working with the older people and get inside the institutions and governance structures and just a demand to have a place at the table. And even though historically, it should have been the case where you enjoy your university life and academics should enjoy doing whatever science they want to do. But we are in an emergency, like we're in a climate emergency where the scientists and the young people, like you have to come together and you have to make sure everything that's happening inside the university, which is very powerful because universities, you know, do professional training, they advise governments, they create the science for lots of things. You know, they have actually quite a big role to play here, and this can change, but the students, and they have to find allies in the older people, have the intergenerational cooperation, and attack the institutions that are obviously following the wrong policies and the wrong pathways. This is not easy to do, but for me, this is the way you will have impact. Is actually to form a coalition with older people. This is the way that you do it. And this happens in a university all the time. This is exactly what's happening in turn. I hope you would feel that your professors are, you know, discussing these issues, will write your reference, try to get you jobs, will promote your ideas in different government places, etc. So, you know, I think intergeneral, and to go back to the vision, it talks about future generations, but cooperation and dialogue across the age groups of the current generation, and that's probably the right approach. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we can go on and on about this for hours if we have the time, but unfortunately, there is a lot of issues. For example, all of us are from different countries, and I think we are facing severe time constraints. But thank you very much. I think you answered a lot of our questions. So now, ambassadors and special guests, we have come to the conclusion of our first module of the G17 University Ambassadors Consortium. And let me first express my sincere gratitude to Professor Walsh for taking time off his very busy schedule to help educate our change makers in the importance of the implementation of the SDGs. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming with us.
No, it's always a pleasure to make time. Like I've taught students every year of my life for the last 35 years, so it's always a pleasure to talk to undergraduates and students. And obviously, I think I just put in the Sdg Academy that I run at the moment. So these are courses that you might like to do to learn more in the SDG that you're responsible for. But I would encourage you, like leadership is not easy, you know, so I would encourage you to feel empowered to start working with others and to try and go to people in government and go to people in university or even corporations and say, you know, the person doing the city project, for example, just get the allies and support. You'd be surprised how people will support you if you take these type of initiatives. So it's hard to do it on your own. It's nearly impossible, but it becomes actually possible when you work with others and you kind of see it that way, and you know where, you've got to attack the point of power and decision making actually to make change. And I don't mean attack, I mean in a peaceful manner. So in a sense, to change the policies, to change the agendas, it's put a lot of kind of energy and argument and partnerships. That's the way forward. It's not easy, but there has been success across the world. But congratulations on the initiative. And I'll hear more about the initiative, and it's great to see the cooperation. I'd love to see the cooperation across the university leaders as a result of the cooperation of the undergraduate students. I think that would be quite marvelous. So congrats everyone. I hope you feel empowered, and it's very needed at the moment. So everyone is doing the right thing to do their best to drive to peace and drive to sustainable development in the way they can do it, or the way they think they can do it. And thank you for the invitation.
Of course, Professor, thank you very much for joining us. So ambassadors,
I think there is a connection issue with Manisha. So Ambassador, that's the end of this session today. And thank you everyone for being part of the session, and the professor for joining us. And all of you all could also take the Digital University quiz at the G17 portal. So looking forward to do many sessions with the Digital University. Thank you and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone.
apologies, ambassadors, I had a few technical difficulties, but we have come to the conclusion of our session, and we would like to thank the Youth for Green Hydrogen team for their continued support with the Zoom platform, to the G17 University Ambassadors Consortium, as well as the SDG Impact Chat team for their continued guidance and support with our initiative. And finally, I'd like to thank every single one of you who came here, the guests, the ambassadors, the executives who joined us from around the world, who continue to impress and carry out multiple projects and help in achieving the 2030 goal for G17. And as your host for the evening, I have been Manasha Samuel Diwakar. I bid you good night, good afternoon, and a very good weekend coming forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good night.